Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The Great Hall vibrated with a tension that was almost physical. It hummed up through the flagstones, a low thrum of anxiety that set my teeth on edge. From my corner in the kitchens, hidden behind a rack of drying herbs, I could hear the strained laughter of the pack's senior warriors and the brittle, high-pitched chatter of their mates. They were celebrating the successful hunt at the northern ridge, a victory that should have filled the keep with revelry. Instead, it was a gathering of ghosts, each one waiting for the haunting to begin. They were waiting for him, Alpha King Rayleigh Vornak. His name was never spoken above a whisper, a curse swallowed before it could fully form. They called him the Untamed, the Beast of the Black Wood, the King of Fury. Legend said he was born with the winter's rage trapped in his heart, that his first cry had cracked the stones of his birthing chamber. He was a king who ruled not with wisdom or decree, but with the sheer terrifying force of his presence. His curse was the pack's burden, a volatile power that could protect them from their enemies one moment and tear them apart the next. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, the rough-spun cloth of my tunic scratching my skin. My hands, raw from lye soap and endless work, trembled as I sorted through a basket of wild mint. I was invisible here. A barren omega, wolfless and voiceless, was less than a ghost. I was a void, a failure of nature in a world that worshipped strength and bloodlines. To be barren was to be a dead end. To be without a strong wolf was to be defenseless. I had learned long ago that my silence was my only value. A silent shame was a manageable one. A sudden sharp crash from the hall sent a tremor through the floor. A woman shrieked, the sound cut short. The forced laughter died, replaced by a thick, suffocating quiet. He was here. I didn't need to see him to know. The air grew heavy, charged with a primal energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The scent of ozone and something wild, like a lightning strike in a deep forest, flooded the kitchens, overpowering the smell of roasting meat and baking bread. It was the scent of his rage, a physical manifestation of the storm inside him. Then came the first roar. It was not the sound of a man or a wolf. It was something deeper, more guttural, a sound torn from the very bedrock of the earth. It shattered the silence and echoed in my bones. A promise of utter destruction. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. But it did no good. The sound was inside me. The screams began in earnest then. Men shouted orders that were lost in the cataclysm. I heard the splintering of the great oak tables, the shattering of pottery, the sickening wet thud of bodies hitting stone walls. This was not a simple fit of temper. This was the beast breaking its chains. His council had tried everything: iron bindings, ancient rituals, calming drafts from the pack healers. Nothing worked. When the fury took him, he was no longer a king. He was a weapon without a wielder. A young kitchen hand, a boy named Finn, with eyes the color of a summer sky, stumbled back through the doorway, his face pale as milk. He threw Lord Vorlog through the west window, he stammered, his body shaking so violently he could barely stand. The Alpha. He doesn't see us. He just destroys. The head cook, a stout, grim-faced woman named Alara, grabbed Finn by the collar and shoved him toward the root cellar. "Get below! All of you, bar the door and do not make a sound." The others scrambled, their faces masks of terror, but I was frozen. My feet felt as though they had been fused to the stone. The sounds of carnage grew louder, closer. A warrior's body flew past the kitchen entrance, landing in a heap of broken limbs against the far wall. The scent of blood, hot and metallic, cut through the air. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic drum against the symphony of destruction. I had to hide. My mind screamed it, but my body wouldn't obey. All I could think of was my mother. I could see her face, kind and worn, her hands weaving flowers into my hair when I was a child, before the pack had declared me barren, before the whispers and the pity had driven her to an early grave. She used to sing to me when I was afraid. A simple lullaby, a melody as soft and gentle as her touch. The moon is a cradle, the stars are a veil. Sleep now, my little wolf, a new day will prevail. The memory was so sharp, so painful, it was a physical blow. The lullaby had been my secret comfort for years, a melody I hummed under my breath when the loneliness became a crushing weight. It was the only piece of my mother I had left. The beast's roar shook the very foundations of the keep again, this time right outside the kitchen archway. I could hear his massive claws scraping against the stone floor, a sound like daggers being dragged across a tombstone. He was hunting, not for prey, but for something to break. A primal, instinctual fear finally broke through my paralysis. I dove behind a stack of empty barrels in the darkest corner of the room, curling into a tight ball. I pulled my thin tunic over my head, as if the flimsy fabric could shield me from the monster just feet away. Tremors racked my body. Tears streamed down my face, silent and hot. I was going to die here, a nameless, forgotten Omega, torn apart by the king she had never even met. My lips trembled. Without thought, without will, a sound escaped them. It was barely a whisper, a thread of melody lost in the chaos. The moon is a cradle. The humming was involuntary, a desperate, hopeless prayer from a part of my soul I thought had long since died. My own voice sounded foreign, rusty from disuse, but it was there. The stars are a veil, I sang it to myself, to the terrified child cowering inside me, a shield of sound against a world of violence. The beast roared again, a deafening explosion of sound, and the barrels beside me shuddered. I flinched, certain this was the end. I squeezed my eyes tighter and kept singing, my voice trembling but steady, a tiny flicker of light in an all-consuming darkness. Sleep now, my little wolf, a new day will prevail. And then, silence. It felt like a physical weight, sudden and absolute. The roaring stopped, the crashing stopped. The screaming had already faded. All that remained was the crackling of the torches in the hall, the distant moan of the wind, and my own soft, wavering voice. I stopped singing, my breath catching in my throat. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. It was wrong, unnatural. I could hear my own blood pounding in my ears, and beneath it, another sound. The slow, heavy rasp of breathing. It was deep and labored. The sound of a great furnace cooling. It was coming from just beyond the barrels, from the entrance to the kitchen. He was there. I held my breath, praying to the old gods he hadn't heard me, that he would move on, that his rage would find another target. A shadow fell over me. Slowly, shakily, I lowered the tunic from my face. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw him. He filled the entire archway, a silhouette of nightmare and power. Raelith Vornik was larger than any wolf shifter I had ever seen, his shoulders a span of granite, his body a canvas of muscle and old silvery scars that crisscrossed his skin like a map of forgotten wars. Blood dripped from the claws of one hand, staining the stone floor a deep, viscous black in the torchlight. His broad chest rose and fell with each ragged breath. He was a monument to savagery. But his eyes... The whispers said his eyes burned with the fires of madness, a molten gold that promised pain. But the eyes that were fixed on me now were not burning. They were clear, shockingly, unnervingly lucid. They were the color of ancient amber, and they held an intensity that stripped me bare, peeling back layers of silence and shame until he was staring directly into my soul. He took a step into the kitchen, his movements measured, almost cautious. It was the deliberate grace of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. The entire keep seemed to be holding its breath, 1,000 unseen eyes watching this impossible moment. I was trapped in his gaze, a moth pinned by a collector's needle. He stopped a few feet away, his head tilted. His nostrils flared as he inhaled, taking a long, deep draft of the air between us. His gaze drifted from my eyes down to my throat, as if he could somehow see the song that was still trembling there. The air crackled with a new kind of tension, something other than fear. It was a raw, possessive focus. The Alpha King, the untamed beast, was looking at me as if I were the only thing in his entire world. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. It wasn't the sound of rage that had torn the hall apart. This was different. It was a possessive, territorial sound that vibrated through the floor and straight into my bones, a primal claim that needed no words. He raised his blood-stained hand, not to strike, but slowly, deliberately, reaching for me. He was going to touch me. The thought was so terrifying, so impossible, that my own breath hitched, a tiny, audible gasp in the profound silence. His amber eyes narrowed, focusing on the minute sound, and his hand stilled in the air between us, inches from my face. He hadn't just heard the song, he had heard me, his hand, stained with the proof of his carnage, hung in the air between us like a death sentence. The scent of him was overwhelming, ozone, pine needles crushed underfoot, and a deep musky scent that was purely male, purely alpha. It was the scent of power itself, and it made the phantom wolf inside me want to curl into a ball and submit. My breath was a prisoner in my lungs. My entire world had shrunk to the space between his calloused fingertips and my skin. He moved with an unnatural slowness, as if fighting an internal war for control over his own muscles. The knuckles were scarred, the veins prominent, a hand built for wielding a sword or breaking a neck. Yet when his fingers finally brushed against my jaw, the touch was so gentle it was like being grazed by a moth's wing. It was a shocking, impossible tenderness. A tremor went through me, a violent shudder that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the contact. Heat bloomed where he touched me, a searing brand on my cold skin. For a decade, no one had touched me with anything but disdain or accidental carelessness. To be touched like this, with such focused, deliberate reverence, was an earthquake to my soul. His thumb stroked slowly along my cheekbone, and his amber eyes tracked the tiny movement, his expression one of profound, animalistic curiosity. It felt as though he wasn't just touching my face, but trying to decipher the very essence of me through his skin. The growl rumbled in his chest again, low and constant now, like the purr of some great cat. It wasn't a threat. It was satisfaction. The sound vibrated through his hand into my bones, a resonant hum that seemed to calm the frantic hammering of my own heart, sinking it to his slower, more powerful rhythm. The spell was shattered by a sharp intake of breath from the archway. My king? The voice was strained, cautious. I risked a glance past Raylith's formidable shoulder. It was Kalen, the Alpha King's beta, his second in command. His face, normally a mask of stern authority, was ashen. His eyes were wide, darting from the terrifying calm on his alpha's face to me, the insignificant Omega cowering in the corner. Behind him, a handful of the king's personal guard stood frozen, their weapons half drawn, their faces a mixture of disbelief and raw fear. They were looking at me as if I were a witch who had just enchanted their beast. Raylith did not turn. He didn't even acknowledge Kalen's presence. His gaze remained locked on me, his thumb still tracing a hypnotic path along my skin. The world outside of his touch seemed distant, muted. Alpha, Kalen tried again, his voice firmer, though the tremor was still there. The healers are attending the wounded. The hall is... We need your command. For a long moment, Raylith remained silent, his attention wholly consumed by me. Then he slowly drew his hand back. The loss of his warmth was immediate and jarring, leaving my skin feeling cold and painfully exposed. He finally turned his head, a slow, deliberate motion that carried 1,000 pounds of menace. He looked at his beta, and though his rage was gone, the sheer force of his authority was a palpable wave that made Kaelin take an involuntary step back. "Clear the hall," Raylith commanded. His voice was a gravelly baritone, rough from the monstrous roars, a sound like stones grinding together in the deep earth. It was the first coherent command he had given since the Fury had claimed him. He turned his gaze back to me, and it was as if no one else in the world existed. He looked at me, then gestured with his chin. "She comes with me." The words, simple and absolute, hung in the air like a death knell. Kaelin's eyes widened further, his gaze flicking to me with a new, horrified understanding. He opened his mouth to protest, a flicker of dissent in his eyes, but Raylith cut him off with a look so cold it could have frozen fire. The beta's jaw snapped shut, and he gave a stiff, jerky nod. "As you command, Alpha." 2 guards stepped forward. Their movements were hesitant, their fear of their king warring with their duty. One of them, a broad-shouldered warrior with a fresh gash on his forehead, reached for my arm. Before his fingers could touch me, Raylith let out a snarl so vicious, so utterly feral, that the guard recoiled as if he'd been burned. "Do not touch her," the king bit out, his amber eyes flashing with a possessive fire that was, in its own way, as terrifying as his earlier rage. He took a step toward me himself, his shadow swallowing me whole. He didn't reach for me. He simply stood before me, a silent command. "Rise." My limbs felt like lead, but I obeyed, unfolding myself from my cramped position behind the barrels. I felt small and fragile before him, a wren in the shadow of an eagle. My cheap homespun tunic was stained with dust. My hair was a tangled mess, and my face was streaked with tears. The shame was a hot flush that crawled up my neck. From a hidden thing, I had become a spectacle. Raylith turned and strode from the kitchen without a backward glance, the absolute certainty that I would follow him radiating from his every step. The guards fell in behind me, their presence a cage of steel and leather. I had no choice. I walked. The journey through the great hall was a walk through a battlefield. The massive oak tables were overturned. Some splintered into nothing more than kindling. Shards of pottery and goblets crunched under my bare feet. Dark pools of blood stained the flagstones, and the air was thick with the scent of it, mingled with spilled ale and fierce sweat. Healers were tending to the wounded, their soft chants a stark contrast to the groans of the injured warriors. And every eye was on me. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, on the intimidating expanse of Raylith's back, as he carved a path through the devastation he had wrought. The whispers followed me like biting flies. "The little Omega from the kitchens? Barren, isn't she? What does he want with her?" Saw it myself. He was tearing Vorlog's arm off. Then she made a sound and he just stopped. "A witch! She has to be." The words were stones thrown at my already bruised soul. Witch. They thought I was a witch. I wasn't a witch. I was nothing. A girl who had hummed a sad, simple song to comfort herself in the face of death. But in their eyes, that made me dangerous. I could feel their fear and their suspicion coalesce into a palpable hatred. I, who had only ever known their pity and scorn, now had their fear. I wasn't sure which was worse. We left the chaos of the hall and ascended the great stone staircase to the royal wing. Here the air was colder, the tapestries on the walls dark and ancient. The guards at the top of the stairs flattened themselves against the wall as Raylith approached, their eyes downcast in submission and terror. He led me to a heavy iron-banded door at the end of a long, torch-lit corridor. It looked more like the entrance to a dungeon than a king's private chambers. He pushed it open, and the screech of the hinges echoed in the suffocating silence. He gestured for me to enter. I hesitated on the threshold, a fresh wave of fear washing over me. He stopped, turning to look at me, his patience a thin, fraying thread. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a clear warning. I scurried past him into the room, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The chamber was a cage. There were no tapestries here, no furs on the floor, no comforts of a king. The stone walls were bare, scarred with deep gouges, some of them recent. The only window was high and barred, letting in a sliver of cold moonlight. A simple bed with a dark fur cover was pushed against one wall, and a heavy wooden table and 2 chairs were the only other furniture. It was a room designed to contain a monster, to limit the damage he could do to himself and others. This was where the Alpha King slept. This was his prison. Raylith followed me in, closing the heavy door behind us. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the sound of my life ending. He walked past me to a basin of water in the corner and began to wash the blood from his hands and arms. He moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing, his powerful back muscles flexing under his torn tunic. I stood rooted to the spot in the center of the room, wringing my hands, not knowing what to do, what he expected of me. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I was alone with the beast, trapped in his den. Finally, clean of the blood, he turned. He had taken off the ruined tunic, and his bare chest was a roadmap of scars. Old ones, pale and silvery, from battles long past. Newer ones, still pink, from his own claws. He was a living testament to a life of violence, both given and received. He didn't speak. He just watched me, his amber gaze intense and unwavering. He circled the room, moving with the silent tread of a wolf, his eyes never leaving my face. It was an inspection, a predator assessing its new, what? Its new possession? Its new toy? I felt like a mouse being circled by a hawk, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. He stopped in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The scent of him, clean now but still overwhelmingly potent, filled my senses. He was so tall I had to crane my neck to look at his face. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. "Your name," he said. The words were not a question. They were a demand. My throat was dry, my voice a forgotten tool. I swallowed hard, trying to work up the moisture to speak. Irissa, I whispered, the sound barely audible. Irissa, he repeated, tasting the name. He said it as if it were a foreign word, an ancient rune he was trying to decipher. He leaned in closer, his head dipping down. My entire body went rigid. I thought he was going to kiss me, or bite me, I didn't know which. Instead, his nose brushed against the sensitive skin of my neck, just below my ear. He inhaled deeply, a long, slow breath, and a shudder went through his entire massive frame. His voice was a low, rough murmur against my skin, sending a jolt of terrifying electricity through me. Sing! The word hung in the stark, cold air between us. Sing. It was not a request. It was the command of a king, uttered with the raw authority that had brought his warriors to their knees. But it was more than that. It was the desperate plea of a beast. His breath was a warm whisper against my throat, and the very nearness of him stole the air from my lungs. My heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm, a wild bird trapped in the cage of my ribs. I couldn't. The song was my secret. The last sacred piece of my mother, the only comfort in a life of cold silence. To give it to him, to this monster of blood and fury, felt like a violation, a sacrilege. It was mine. My throat closed up, a knot of fear and rebellion tightening with every passing second. He lifted his head, his amber eyes boring into mine. He saw the refusal in them, the flicker of defiance, a muscle in his jaw clenched, and the air grew thick with a renewed tension. The calm I had inadvertently created was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea. I could feel the fury beginning to stir beneath the surface, a low hum of energy that made the scars on his chest seem to stand out in sharper relief. I said, "Sing," he repeated, his voice dropping to a low growl that vibrated through the stone floor. It was a sound that promised a return to the chaos I had just witnessed, a promise that this time, There would be no escape for the Omega, who had dared to defy him. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my defiance. I wasn't just risking my own life. The whispers in the hall echoed in my mind. Witch. Dangerous. If his rage broke free again, here, with me, they would not blame him. They would blame the Baron Omega, who had somehow provoked the beast. They would tear me apart. My lips trembled. I closed my eyes, summoning the ghost of my mother's memory. Her gentle hands, the scent of wildflowers in her hair. I clung to that image as if to a lifeline, and forced the first note from my throat. It was a broken, wavering sound, thin and full of terror. The moon is a cradle. He didn't move. He stood before me, a mountain of scarred flesh and coiled power, and listened. His breathing was a harsh rasp in the silence of the room. I took a shaky breath and continued, my voice slowly gaining a fragile strength. The stars are a veil. As the melody filled the small, barren room, something extraordinary began to happen. The rigid tension in his shoulders started to ease. The hard clench of his jaw softened. The storm in his eyes did not vanish, but the lightning receded, sinking deep below the surface, leaving behind a profound, unnerving stillness. He was like a wild animal being soothed by a strange new sound, wary but utterly captivated. Sleep now, my little wolf. A new day will prevail. When the last note faded into the silence, I kept my eyes shut, not daring to see his reaction. The quiet stretched on, thick and heavy. I could hear his breathing, which had become deeper, slower, almost even. A calloused finger touched my chin, gently tilting my face upward. I opened my eyes. The raw fury was gone. In its place was an expression of such intense, aching focus that it was almost more frightening. He was looking at me as if he were a man dying of thirst, and I was the first drop of rain. His gaze was a physical weight, a brand of ownership being seared onto my soul. Again, he commanded, his voice a raw whisper. And so I sang. Again and again I sang the lullaby my mother had taught me. I sang until my throat was raw and my voice was hoarse. I sang as he moved to one of the heavy chairs by the table and sat, never taking his eyes off me. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched, his entire being seemingly anchored by the fragile thread of my voice. I was the chain, and my song was the lock holding his beast at bay. I sang until the sliver of moonlight from the high, barred window had crawled across the floor, and my body was trembling with exhaustion. Finally, my voice gave out. Cracking on the last note, I swayed on my feet, dizzy from fatigue and fear. Raylith rose from his chair in a single fluid motion. He crossed the room, scooped me up into his arms as if I weighed nothing more than a bundle of herbs, and laid me on his bed. The furs were coarse against my skin, and they smelled of him, of pine and power and cold stone. I was too exhausted to protest, too shocked to move. He did not join me. He pulled a heavy woolen blanket over me, his movements surprisingly gentle. Then he returned to his chair, a silent, sleepless sentinel watching over me in the dark. As my eyes drifted shut, the last thing I saw was the Alpha King, the untamed beast of the Black Wood, sitting vigil in his own prison, his gaze fixed on me, a shadow of profound and terrible possession in the dying torchlight. The days that followed blurred into a surreal existence. I did not return to the kitchens. I did not return to my small, lonely cot in the servants' quarters. My world became the king's chambers, this cage of gold and fury. My life was measured not in sunrises and sunsets, but in the rhythm of his moods. Word spread through the keep like wildfire. The Baron Omega was now the king's what? No one knew what to call me. I was not his mate, not his lover, not his servant. I was his talisman, his living, breathing cage. Every morning, Kalen, his beta, would appear at the door, his face a grim mask of disapproval. He would deliver reports of the pack, his eyes studiously avoiding me, as if my very presence were a stain on his alpha's honor. Raylith would listen, his focus absolute, but his rage, which had once been a constant, simmering threat, was now a distant thunder. It was still there, I could feel it coiled deep within him, but it was dormant, held in check by my proximity. He never let me leave the chambers. Servants brought my food, leaving trays outside the door that Raylith himself would retrieve. He ate with me at the heavy wooden table, the silence between us a living thing. He would watch me, his amber eyes tracking my every move, from the way I lifted a spoon to my lips, to the way I tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear. It was an unnerving, relentless scrutiny. He was studying me, learning me, as if trying to understand the mechanics of the magic I had inadvertently worked upon him. Sometimes the beast would stir, a frustrating report from Kaelin, the scent of a rival pack on the wind carried through the high window, or a memory that haunted his waking hours, would cause the tension to return. A low growl would start in his chest. The air would crackle with energy, and his hands would clench into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. The first time it happened, my blood ran cold, but now I knew what he wanted. Without a word, I would begin to sing. My voice, stronger now from its constant use, would fill the room, and the effect was always the same. The tension would bleed out of him, the growl would soften, and the storm in his eyes would calm. I was his living antidote. One evening, after Kaelin had delivered a particularly dire report about rogue wolves encroaching on their southern territory, the fury rose in him faster and stronger than I had yet seen. His eyes took on a molten glow, and he slammed a fist on the table, cracking the thick oak. I immediately began to sing, my heart pounding. But this time the song wasn't enough. The rage was too strong, too close to the surface. He began to pace the room like a caged lion, his breath coming in harsh pants, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching like coiled springs. "It is not enough," he snarled, turning on me, his face a mask of torment and fury. "Your voice, it soothes the surface, but the fire still burns beneath." He stalked toward me, backing me against the cold stone wall. He braced his hands on either side of my head, trapping me. His scent was overpowering, his body a furnace of contained violence. I sang louder, my voice trembling, praying it would be enough. "There is a poison in my blood, little singer," he rasped, his forehead pressing against mine. I could feel the tremors that racked his body. A madness passed down through my line. "It demands blood, it demands destruction. Your song only makes it sleep, but it always wakes up." Tears pricked my eyes. I was not a witch. I was not a healer. I was just a girl with a song, and my simple magic was failing. He pulled back slightly, his tormented gaze searching my face, as if looking for an answer I didn't have. "Why?" he breathed, the word raw with a pain that seemed centuries old. "Why does the sound of you hold it back at all?" I had no answer. I just looked at him, at the agony in his eyes, and saw not a monster, but a man in a cage far more terrible than the stone room that held us. For the first time, I felt something other than fear for him. It was a flicker of pity, a strange, aching empathy for his curse. Without thinking, I lifted a trembling hand and laid it on his scarred chest, right over his heart. His skin was scorching hot. Beneath my palm, his heart hammered with a brutal, chaotic rhythm. He flinched at my touch, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't pull away. I closed my eyes and focused not on the melody, but on the feeling behind it, the memory of my mother's love, of safety, of peace. I poured all of that into my voice and sang the lullaby one more time, not as a command or a tool, but as a genuine offering of comfort. My voice wrapped around him, and under my hand, I felt the frantic beating of his heart begin to slow. The tremors in his body subsided. He let out a long, ragged breath, and the tension seemed to drain out of him, leaving him weary and spent. He slumped against me, his great weight pressing me into the wall, his face buried in the crook of my neck. He was not touching me with desire, but with a desperate, bone-deep need for an anchor in a raging storm. I could feel his breath, hot and unsteady, against my skin. My hand was still pressed to his chest, his slowing heart a heavy drum beneath my palm. "Irissa," he murmured my name against my throat, his voice thick with a raw, unguarded emotion I had never heard before. It was the sound of a man who had been drowning for a lifetime, finally finding a rock to cling to. And in that moment, as I held the most feared wolf in the land in a fragile truce of song and touch, I realized a terrifying truth. I was no longer just his prisoner. I had become his keeper. The cage was no longer just his. It was mine, too. And I was beginning to fear that the door had locked from the inside. The moment was a fragile eternity. Raylith's great weight pressed against me, his face buried in my neck, his heart a steady, powerful drum against my palm. The scent of him, stripped of the acrid taint of rage, was intoxicating, fine in winter air and something ancient, like the deep earth. For the first time, the beast was not just sleeping, it felt distant. In its place was a man, broken and weary, clinging to the only solace he had ever known. A dangerous warmth spread through my chest, an empathy so fierce it bordered on pain. I had seen past the monster, and the man I found was more perilous still. A sharp, authoritative knock on the iron-banded door shattered the stillness. Raylith went rigid. The man vanished, and the king returned. He pushed himself off the wall, moving away from me with a sudden, jarring swiftness. The loss of his heat was like a physical blow, leaving me cold and exposed. He turned to face the door, his body once again a fortress of muscle and menace, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The brief, raw vulnerability was gone, locked away so completely it felt as if I had imagined it. "Enter," he commanded, his voice a low rumble of authority. The door creaked open to reveal Kalen. His beta's face was a study in grim duty, his eyes hard as flint. But behind him stood a woman I recognized, with a jolt of fear. It was Elder Morwen, the pack's chief healer. She was ancient, her face a web of deep-set wrinkles, her eyes small, dark beads that missed nothing. She was the one who had pronounced me barren a decade ago, her voice devoid of pity as she sealed my fate. She carried a small, covered ceramic bowl, and the air that drifted in with them was thick with the cloying scent of medicinal herbs. Morwen's gaze flickered to me, and her thin lips tightened in disapproval. It was a look I knew well, a look of dismissal, as if I were a piece of dirt on a pristine floor. She then turned her full attention to Raylith. "My king," she said, her voice dry and rustling like dead leaves. "It is time for your draft, to keep the beast settled." She held out the bowl. It was a ritual I had heard whispers of. For years, the elders had been trying to manage Raylith's curse with their concoctions of herbs and ancient remedies, potions that were meant to calm him, to bind his inner wolf, potions that had clearly never worked. Raylith didn't move to take the bowl. He stood as still as a statue, his amber eyes fixed on the offering. A strange, unnatural quiet descended upon the room. From my position near the wall, I watched him, my breath held tight in my chest. He was different. The Raylith of yesterday would have either ignored them completely or swatted the bowl away in a fit of irritation. But this Raylith was observing. His nostrils flared, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, as he scented the air. "You are late, Morwen," he stated, his tone flat and cold. "The preparation required care, Alpha," the old woman replied smoothly, her gaze unwavering. "We had to add a stronger binding agent, given your recent, prolonged episode." Her eyes flicked to me again, the implication clear. My presence was an anomaly that required stronger medicine to counteract. Raylith took a slow, deliberate step forward. He stopped just before the healer, his shadow engulfing her small, wiry frame. He still did not look at the bowl. Instead, his gaze was fixed on her face, a look of such piercing intensity that even the formidable elder seemed to shrink under its weight. "What is in it?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "The usual remedies, my king," Kalen interjected, stepping forward slightly. "Crushed silver wood for calm, moon petal to soothe the spirit, and—" "I was not asking you, Kalen," Raylith cut him off without looking at him. His focus was entirely on Morwen. I am asking the healer who mixed it. Tell me, old one, what scent do I smell beneath the silver wood? Morwen's composure finally cracked. A flicker of something, was it fear, danced in her dark eyes. It is just bitterroot alpha, to mask the sweetness of the petals, a standard ingredient. Liar! The word was a whip crack in the silent room. It was spoken with such chilling certainty that I flinched, and Kaelin took an involuntary step back. Rayleith's hand shot out, not in a display of rage, but with a speed and precision that was far more terrifying. He didn't grab the bowl. He wrapped his fingers around Morwen's wrist. The old healer let out a small, strangled gasp, her eyes widening in shock and pain. The scent is faint, Rayleith said, his voice a low, menacing snarl as he leaned closer to her. Masked by your bitterroot and your lies, but my senses are clearer than they have been in years. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. It smells like poison, like a chain meant not to soothe, but to weaken. His gaze lifted from Morwen and settled on Kaelin. It was a look of profound, terrible betrayal. You knew, he said, the two words a death sentence. Alpha, I swear, Kaelin began, his face pale. It is for your own good, for the good of the pack. It only dampens the beast's strength, makes the rage manageable. It makes me dull, Rayleith corrected, his grip tightening on Morwen's wrist. The ceramic bowl trembled in her other hand. It clouds my mind. It weakens my wolf. You have not been trying to cure me. You have been trying to control me. The revelation struck me with the force of a physical blow. The curse, the madness they all whispered about, they hadn't been trying to heal it. They had been using it, managing it with a subtle poison that kept their king powerful enough to protect them, but broken enough to be led. They had been keeping him in his cage. With a sudden violent motion, Rayleith released Morwen's wrist and snatched the bowl from her. He brought it to his nose, taking one long, deep inhale. A shudder of pure, unadulterated fury went through his massive frame. But this was not the blind, destructive rage I had seen before. This was a cold, focused inferno. His eyes, when he lifted them, burned with a terrifying lucidity. They were the eyes of a king who had just realized his crown was a sham and his throne was a trap. For how long, he snarled, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. How many years have you been feeding me this filth? Neither Kaelin nor Morwen could answer. They were frozen, trapped in the glare of a predator who was for the first time fully, completely awake. In that moment, I understood. My song hadn't just soothed the beast, it had cleared the fog. It had given him a moment of genuine peace, a respite from the poison that had clouded his senses for years. My simple lullaby had given him back his clarity, and with that clarity, he had finally scented the truth of his own betrayal. Rayleith turned his burning gaze to me. It was no longer the look of a curious predator or a desperate man. It was the look of a king who had found his only ally in a court of traitors. He saw me, truly saw me, not as a tool or a talisman, but as the source of his awakening. He walked toward me, the heavy bowl still in his hand. Kaelin made a slight move to intercept him, and Rayleith shot him a look so full of feral warning that the beta froze in his tracks. He stopped in front of me, his presence a wall of heat and power. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. I looked into his eyes and saw the same agonizing betrayal I had felt my entire life, magnified 1,000 times over. He lifted his free hand and, with a gesture so gentle it made my breath catch, he tucked a stray piece of my hair behind my ear. His fingers brushed against my skin, sending a jolt of heat through me. Everything they told me was a lie, he murmured, his voice for my ears alone. My curse, my madness, they nurtured it. Then his gaze hardening, he turned back to Kaelin and Morwen. He held up the ceramic bowl. This pack has been poisoned by fear and deceit, he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound power that resonated in the very stones of the room. The elders have fed it. My own beta has allowed it. He looked down at the bowl, a sneer of contempt twisting his lips. And then he did something that sealed all of our fates. He tipped the bowl not onto the floor, but over his own hand, letting the thick, green, foul-smelling paste cover his skin. No more, he vowed. Without breaking eye contact with his treacherous counsel, he brought his hand to his mouth and licked the poison from his palm. The act was one of supreme, terrifying defiance. He consumed the poison with a deliberate, challenging slowness, his amber eyes locked on Kaelin and Morwen, daring them to react. A guttural sound of horror escaped the old healer's throat. Kaelin's face was a mask of disbelief, the blood draining from it until his skin was the color of old parchment. This was not part of their plan. A weakened, manageable king did not willingly swallow the full, undiluted dose of his own chains. Rayleigh lowered his hand, a smear of green paste still on his lips. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence in the room was absolute, a crushing weight of anticipation. Then a tremor started in his hand, a violent shudder that quickly spread up his arm to his shoulder until his entire massive frame was racked with convulsions. He dropped to one knee with a grunt of pain, his free hand clutching at his chest. A low, agonized growl tore from his throat, a sound of pure animalistic torment. It wasn't the roar of rage. It was the howl of a creature being torn apart from the inside. "Alpha!" Kaelin cried out, taking a step forward, his betrayal forgotten in a surge of instinctual panic for his king. "Stay back!" Rayleigh snarled, the words twisted by pain. He lifted his head and his eyes. They were no longer clear amber. They were boiling, a molten gold swirling with blackness. The poison wasn't dulling him. It was reacting with the full, undiluted force of his true nature, a chemical fire poured onto a raging inferno. "What have you done?" I whispered, the words lost in the rising storm of his agony. I scrambled forward, my own fear eclipsed by a terrifying protective urge. He was on all fours now, his body contorting. The sound of his bones shifting and cracking filled the room, a sickening symphony of transformation. This was not a controlled shift. It was a violent, convulsive change, forced upon him by the war raging in his veins. His skin stretched, his features elongated, and dark, coarse fur sprouted from his flesh in angry patches. "Sing!" Kaelin yelled at me, his face desperate. "By the gods, girl, sing for him!" But I was frozen, watching the horror unfold. The beast that was emerging was not the great dark wolf of a shifter. It was something malformed, something broken. One moment it looked like a wolf, the next a man, a horrifying creature caught between two worlds, its body a battleground for its warring natures. It thrashed on the stone floor, a monster of agony, its howls a blend of human screams and wolf cries. This was his curse. This was the madness Morwen and the others had sought to contain. It wasn't just rage. It was an unstable, poisoned bloodline. The drafts hadn't just weakened him. They had been holding this horrifying, broken transformation at bay. By consuming the poison in a moment of clarity, he had unleashed the full, untamed horror of his affliction. "Your song is the only thing that's ever worked," Kaelin pleaded, his voice cracking. "Do it now!" His words broke through my shock. I stumbled closer to the thrashing form on the floor, my heart threatening to beat its way out of my chest. I opened my mouth, but only a choked sob came out. How could a simple lullaby fight this? How could a memory of love stand against a pain that was shattering a king? The creature on the floor stilled for a moment, its head lifting. One eye was molten gold, human in its torment. The other was the black, feral eye of a wolf. It focused on me, a glimmer of recognition in the depths of its agony. A single guttural word escaped its twisted mouth, a sound that was half Rayleigh's voice, half beast's snarl. "Erissa!" That was all it took. His voice, his name for me, spoken from the heart of the nightmare. It was a plea, a desperate anchor. I knelt on the cold stone, just beyond the reach of his thrashing limbs. I took a deep, shuddering breath, closed my eyes, and sang. I poured every ounce of my will, my strange empathy, my terror, and my desperate hope into the melody. My voice filled the chamber, a fragile thread of sound against the backdrop of his pained howls. But it was there. It was a light in the darkness. I sang of the cradle moon and the starry veil, my voice growing stronger, more certain with each repetition. I wasn't just singing the words. I was projecting the feeling, the memory of pure, unconditional comfort, a shield of peace against his world of pain. Slowly, miraculously, the violent thrashing began to subside. The awful sound of cracking bones lessened. The guttural cries softened into deep, shuddering groans. The half-formed creature on the floor relaxed, muscle by muscle, as my voice washed over it. The transformation didn't complete, nor did it fully reverse. It simply stopped. He lay on the floor, a monstrous form of wolf and man, his breathing ragged but deep. The convulsions had ceased. His eyes, both of them now a hazy, clouded amber, were fixed on me. The beast was not sleeping, it was listening. "Keep going," Kalen breathed, his voice filled with awe and terror. "Don't stop." I didn't. I kept singing, my voice growing hoarse. I sang as Morwen, her face a mask of horrified fascination, backed slowly out of the room. I sang as Kalen stood a silent, shaken vigil by the door. I sang as the last of the torchlight died, leaving us in the cold, blue glow of the moon filtering through the high window. Hours passed. My throat was raw. My body ached from kneeling on the hard stone. But I didn't dare stop. Raylith, the creature he had become, did not move. He just lay there, breathing in time with the cadence of my lullaby, his gaze never leaving me. He was trapped, and I was the walls of his prison, the bars on his cage. Finally, as the first hint of dawn threatened the sky, his form began to shift again. This time it was a slow, controlled regression. The fur receded, the bones shifted back with soft clicks, rather than violent cracks. Soon it was the man who lay on the floor, naked and slick with sweat, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the ordeal. He was unconscious, his face etched with lines of exhaustion and pain, but he was whole. He was himself. I finally fell silent, the quiet in the room ringing in my ears. The exhaustion hit me like a physical blow, and I slumped against the wall, my head spinning. Kalen rushed forward, pulling a heavy fur from the bed and covering his king's body. He looked from Raylith's still form to me, his expression a complex mixture of fear, respect, and something else I couldn't quite decipher. "No one has ever brought him back from the change fever," he said, his voice a low, stunned whisper. "It has always had to run its course, leaving him half dead for days. What are you?" I had no answer. I was Irissa, a barren Omega, a girl with a song. He helped me to my feet, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You need to rest," he said, his tone no longer dismissive, but filled with a new, grudging deference. He led me to the chair, and I sank into it, my limbs feeling like water. "The council will hear of this," Kalen murmured, more to himself than to me. "Of the poison, of Morwen's lies." His eyes hardened. "There will be a reckoning." He looked at me again. "He will protect you. I see that now. You are not his weakness, are you? You are his anchor." Before I could process his words, Raylith stirred on the floor, letting out a low moan. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his movements weak but determined. His eyes, clear and lucid once more, scanned the room until they found me. "Irissa," he rasped, his voice rough. He tried to stand, but his body betrayed him, and he fell back with a groan. The poison and the fever had taken their toll. He was weak, vulnerable in a way I had never imagined possible. "My king, you must rest," Kalen urged, moving to help him. Raylith ignored him. He held his hand out to me, a silent plea. "Don't leave." My heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his voice. This was the Alpha King, the beast, the terror of the North, and he was looking at me as if I were the only thing holding his world together. I stood on shaky legs and went to him, kneeling by his side on the cold floor. I took his hand. His skin was feverishly hot. but his grip was surprisingly strong, clinging to mine as if he were a drowning man. He looked past me, his gaze locking with his betas. "Kaelin," he ordered, his voice gaining a sliver of its former strength. "Summon the full council, every elder, every pack alpha under my command. Tell them their king has awakened, and tell them I am bringing my queen." His eyes shifted back to me, the word hanging in the air between us like a brand. Queen. The title was an absurdity, a madness. I was a Baron Omega. I could never be a queen. But as I looked into his amber eyes, I saw that he was not mad. He was utterly, terrifyingly sane. And I saw something else, something that made my blood run both hot and cold. It was a vow, a claim. He wasn't just protecting his anchor. He was binding her to him, forging a chain that had nothing to do with curses or songs. It was a chain of possession, of destiny, and in his exhausted but resolute gaze, I saw that he would sooner tear his world apart than ever let me go. The word queen echoed in the stone chamber long after Kaelin, his face a mask of shocked obedience, had departed to carry out the king's command. It was a preposterous, impossible word. Queens were of high blood, chosen for their strength, their lineage, their ability to bear powerful heirs. I was the antithesis of a queen. I was a Baron Omega from the kitchens, a shadow given form only by the king's strange fixation. To call me his queen was not just a declaration. It was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown at the feet of every tradition and law our people held sacred. Raelith was still weak, but his will was a tangible force in the room. He refused to be moved to the bed, instead allowing me to help him into one of the heavy chairs by the table. I brought him water, my hands trembling as I held the cup to his lips. He drank deeply, his eyes never leaving my face, his grip on my hand unrelenting. The fever still burned in him, but his mind was sharp, his focus absolute. "They will not accept it," I whispered, the first words I had spoken since he'd collapsed. "They will never accept me." "They will accept what I decree," he stated, his voice still rough but laced with cold iron. "For years they have ruled me through my affliction. They used my pain as a leash. That time is over. They feared the beast. They will learn to fear its master." His thumb stroked the back of my hand, a surprisingly gentle gesture that sent a shiver through my entire body. "You are not a leash, Erissa. You are the key. You did not just soothe the beast. You quieted the poison. You gave me clarity. You gave me myself. That is a power greater than any bloodline." He saw the doubt, the ingrained shame, in my eyes. He leaned forward, his intensity a palpable force. "Do you think I don't know what they call you? Barren, wolfless? A void? They are blind. I have seen the strength of your spirit. I have felt the power in your voice. Your wolf is not absent, little singer. It is just quiet, a survivor's quiet, but it is there. I can feel it." His words struck a chord deep inside me, a place I had thought long dead. For my entire life I had been defined by my lack, by the emptiness within. He was the first person to ever suggest there was something more, a hidden strength rather than a hollow space. It was a terrifying, seductive thought. Servants arrived with fresh clothes for the king and, to my astonishment, a gown for me. It was not the simple homespun of a servant, but a deep forest green velvet, soft and heavy, with delicate silver embroidery at the cuffs. It was a queen's gown. Wearing it felt like a betrayal of the girl who had scrubbed pots in the kitchen, a lie I was wrapping myself in. But when I emerged from behind a privacy screen, the look in Raelith's eyes stole the breath from my lungs. He looked at me with a raw, possessive hunger that had nothing to do with his curse and everything to do with the man he was. It was the look of an alpha who has found his mate, a primal recognition that transcended rank and station. In that moment, the cavernous chamber felt small, the air thick with an unspoken, undeniable truth. The bond between us was not just about his curse anymore. It was becoming something else entirely, something far more dangerous. The great hall had been transformed. The wreckage from Raelith's rampage had been cleared. The long tables were arranged in a semicircle facing the two high-backed thrones on the dais, which had remained untouched. Every elder was present, their grim faces like stone carvings in the torchlight. Every pack alpha from the surrounding territories was there, their warriors standing behind them, a silent army of muscle and suspicion. The air was thick with tension, a low growl of anticipation and dissent. When Raelith entered the hall, he did not walk ahead of me. He kept my hand firmly in his, our fingers laced together, and walked beside me. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled wolves. His face was pale and drawn from his ordeal, but he walked with the unshakable authority of a true king. I kept my eyes downcast, feeling the weight of 1,000 hostile stares, the whispers slithering through the air like snakes. An Omega? Has the madness finally taken his mind? She is barren, a disgrace to the throne. Raelith led me not to the side, not to a place of honor beside the throne, but directly to the dais itself. He stopped before the two great chairs and turned to face his people. He did not release my hand. You were summoned to bear witness. His voice boomed through the hall, silencing the whispers with its raw power. You see me before you, clear of mind and purpose. For too long, this pack has been ruled by fear. Fear of my affliction, a fear that my own counsel has nurtured and used. His gaze swept over the elders, settling on Morwen, who stood among them, her face a mask of defiant fury. You were told my rage was a curse of blood, a lie. It was a fever, born of a poison fed to me since I was a boy. A poison meant to keep me weak, controllable. A wave of shock and disbelief washed over the pack alphas. They looked from their king to the elders, their loyalty suddenly a fractured, uncertain thing. The poison kept my wolf trapped in a cage of pain, Raelith continued, his voice resonating with a terrible, cold anger. It kept me from my own senses, but no more. The deception is at an end. He held up our joined hands. This woman, Irissa Calwyn, is the one who broke the fever. Her spirit is the antidote to their poison. Her strength gave me back my own. He turned to me, and in front of the entire assembly, he knelt on one knee. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. A king did not kneel, not to anyone. He lifted my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles, his amber eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering devotion. I claim you, Irissa, not as a healer, not as a consort. I claim you as my mate, my queen, the unbreakable chain that binds my soul. Then he looked out at the silent, stunned faces. She is my choice, my destiny. Anyone who disputes her place disputes me. Anyone who raises a hand or a voice against her will answer to the beast they sought to chain, and they will find its chains are broken. His proclamation was met with a deafening silence. It was a declaration of war against tradition, against the very laws of their society. I could feel their rejection, a cold, hard wall of it pressing in on me from all sides. I was an imposter, a witch, a barren Omega who had somehow ensnared their king and now threatened to pollute their sacred bloodline. The silence was broken by a single powerful voice. I dispute it. It was Lord Vorlog, the alpha whose arm Raelith had nearly torn from its socket. He was a mountain of a man, his arm in a heavy sling, his face contorted in a mask of rage and humiliation. You would place this nothing on the throne beside you? A barren shell who cannot give the pack an heir? This is not the act of a king. It is the proof of your madness. A chorus of assent rose from several of the other pack alphas, their own ambitions and prejudices ignited by Vorlog's defiance. She has bewitched him, someone shouted. This union is a blight, another roared. Raelith rose to his feet, a low, dangerous growl rumbling in his chest. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop. The rage was returning, but this time it was not the blind fury of the beast. It was the cold, focused wrath of a king whose queen had been insulted. But before he could speak, before he could unleash the violence that was coiling in his muscles, something shifted inside me. The fear, the shame, the years of being a voiceless ghost, It all coalesced into a single sharp point of defiance. He had called me his queen. He had kneeled to me. He had looked at me and seen strength where everyone else saw only emptiness. And they were trying to tear him down for it. I let go of his hand. I took a step forward, to the very edge of the dais, and I looked at them. I looked at Vorlog, at the sneering alphas, at the hateful elders. For the first time in my life, I did not look away. I opened my mouth, and I did the only thing I knew how to do. I sang. It was not the lullaby. It was something else. A sound that came from the deepest part of my soul, from the quiet, hidden wolf he had sworn was there. It was a melody of profound, heart-wrenching sorrow, a lament for every slight, every moment of scorn, every lonely night I had endured. It was the song of the Omega, the song of the outcast. But as the melody swelled, it changed. The sorrow deepened into a note of resilience, the resilience into a chord of strength, and the strength into a soaring, powerful declaration of existence. It was my soul made audible, a force of pure, untamed emotion that I had kept locked away my entire life. The effect on the hall was immediate and profound. It was not a soothing sound. It was a sound that seized them. It bypassed their anger and their prejudice and struck them directly in the heart of their own wolves. Warriors hardened by 100 battles found their eyes stinging with unshed tears. Their mates covered their mouths, their bodies trembling. The song spoke of their own hidden pains, their own secret griefs. It was the soul of the pack, the loneliness at the heart of the lone wolf, given a voice. When the last note faded, a new kind of silence fell over the hall. It was not the silence of dissent. It was the silence of awe. I stood before them, my chest heaving, my body trembling with the force of the release. I had shown them my soul. I had nothing left to fear. Raelith came to stand beside me, his presence a warm, solid wall of support. He did not touch me, but I could feel his pride, his fierce joy. He looked out at his stunned, silent people. "You have heard her voice," he said, his own voice quiet now, but carrying more weight than any roar. "That is the soul of your queen. Now, who among you still disputes my claim?" No one spoke. Not a single wolf dared to meet his gaze or mine. Lord Vorlog, his face pale, looked down at the floor, his challenge broken. Raelith slid his arm around my waist, pulling me against his side. It was a gesture of possession, of unity, a silent declaration to the world. He was the fury, and I was the song. Together they did not have a curse. They had a kingdom. The first snow of winter fell like a promise, blanketing the black wood in a shroud of pristine silence. From the high, unbarred window of the royal chamber, I watched the flakes drift down, each one a unique and perfect crystal. The room was no longer a cage. It was a sanctuary. Rich tapestries depicting the history of the Voronok line now hung on the walls, and thick furs covered the floor. The scent of pine and burning oak from the hearth mingled with the softer scent of sleeping wolf. On the great bed, Raelith slept. He lay on his side, his scarred body relaxed in a way I had never thought possible. Sleep no longer offered him torment, but true rest. The beast still dwelled within him, a formidable primal power, but it was not a curse. It was a part of him, balanced now by the quiet strength of my own spirit. The poison was gone from his system, and with it, the fever madness. His rages, when they came, were the focused, controlled fury of a king protecting his own, not the blind destruction of a monster. Our union had been a storm that reshaped the pack. The treacherous elders, led by Morwen, had been exiled, their deceit exposed to the light. Kaelin, his loyalty reforged in the fires of truth, now served his alpha with a fierce, unwavering devotion. Lord Vorlog and the other dissenting alphas had bent the knee, their challenge silenced not by fear of the beast, but by respect for the queen whose voice had laid their own souls bare. They still called me the Song Queen, the Omega who sang a king to his senses. I was still barren, and that truth had not changed. But it was no longer a mark of shame. It was simply a part of who I was. The pack had learned that the strength of a queen was not measured only by the heirs she could produce, but by the unity and peace she could bring to her people. And under our rule, for the first time in a generation, the pack knew peace. A soft whimper came from the cradle near the fire. My heart swelled, a feeling so powerful it almost hurt. I crossed the room and looked down at the small, sleeping form bundled in soft furs. A baby girl, no more than a few weeks old, with a shock of dark hair and a fierce, determined frown that was all her father. Her name was Lyra. She was an orphan, the daughter of a warrior who had fallen to the rogues at the southern border before our reign had brought security. When I had found her, a small wailing thing with no one to care for her, something inside me had clicked into place. The quiet phantom wolf within me had finally awakened. Not with a roar, but with a powerful surge of maternal instinct. Raelith had agreed without hesitation. A queen is the mother of her pack, he had said, his amber eyes soft as he looked at the child in my arms. Blood does not make a family. Love does. Lyra began to stir, her small face scrunching up as she prepared to cry. I reached down and gently rocked the cradle, my voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. The moon is a cradle, the stars are a veil. On the bed, Raelith shifted, a low, contented rumble in his chest. His eyes opened, the clear, warm amber of a summer evening. He watched me, his expression full of a love so profound it was a physical presence in the room. Sleep now, my little wolf. A new day will prevail. Lyra's fussing quieted, and her breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep. I looked from the child, our daughter of the heart, to the man, my mate of the soul. They called him the untamed beast, and they had called me the silent Omega. They were both wrong. He was a king who had been caged, and I was a woman whose song had been waiting for the one soul who was worthy enough to hear it. My voice had become his salvation, and in saving him, I had finally found my own. He was the fury, I was the lullaby, and together we were the unbreakable song of the Vornek pack.